Haugen again. It is my pleasure to welcome into our Daily Dodge TV studio this afternoon. Joining me on Community Comment today for the second time, it is my pleasure to welcome back to our studios, actually, Shana Hannerman. She is the Bank Secrecy Act Officer of Farmers and Merchants Union Bank in Columbus. That's quite the mouthful.
It is.
I had to make sure I write that down, that I remembered it correctly, because it is a mouthful, but it is a really important job that financial institutions have. And Shana, we dived a little bit into the last time you were on, kind of what that job is. But I might have you do that in just one more second for any of our listeners or viewers out there who missed the last show. Just to give them a brief recap, I'll ask you that in just a second. But if anyone out there who is tuning in to Community Comment today has a question with our guest today, we're going to be talking about fraud, financial scams, all that important information. If you do have a question for our guest today, you can call into our show at 887-9595, or you can text 887-4446 to get on Community Comment today and ask any questions that you may have. But Shana, before we dive into some of our topics here today, and one of them highlights a very recent scam attempt in the Dodge County area. But before we do that, again, just if you don't mind, for our listeners and viewers out there, what exactly is a Bank Secrecy Act officer?
So a Bank Secrecy Act officer is usually in charge of day-to-day functions when it comes to monitoring for suspicious activity, things like that. And I'm lucky enough working for a community bank where I get to wear several hats, so I get to dive much deeper into things like the fraud world. And so that really stretches into similar topics related to what's happening in our community. And so, like I said, it's relevant with my job function, but I really get to get deep into those conversations with customers and my staff members.
Fantastic. Again, we are joined with Shana Hannerman here on Community Comment. The phone numbers to get into the program, 887-9595, or you can text 885-4446 to get on Community Comment today. But I had mentioned it briefly before we started, Shana, that there was a very recent incident here in Dodge County that was highlighted in a press release from the Dodge County Sheriff's Office that came out last Friday. It involved an individual, I believe, from the Lamira area, that they had been contacted, and there was a large amount of cash that was potentially attempted to be fraudulently deceived or scammed from this individual. But you can read the specifics online. On dailydodge.com, we have a story about that, or on Facebook as well. But just kind of, if you don't mind, just kind of go through what this scam was and what happened, and kind of walk us through what this individual may have been experiencing when they were reached out by the scammer.
So when I read the news release, I went, that sounds really familiar. It's not the same scenario, but it's the same storyline, because this is happening more often than I think people are realizing, even in our area. I had an experience probably about a month prior with somebody who had taken cash out. We're talking over $30,000, and they were coached to lie to the bank of why they were taking that cash out. They came back the next day and wanted to take out over $15,000 for the same reason, and that was enough to spark the conversation of what's really going on here. So the story for my particular example is that they believed that their money was unsafe. Mm-hmm. They were told that it was unsafe in their bank accounts, and they believed that they were talking to the Federal Trade Commission, so FTC, and at one point talking with the U.S. Treasury Department. And so, when you start putting these big government entity names out there, it seems very, very serious. And then they said, you need to move your money to a secure account. In this case, they had said, well, we'll set up a passphrase for somebody to come and pick this money up from you, and we'll put it in this government secured account. That's not a thing. And they do. They show up in person to your home to collect this cash, and it's scary. And so it's not the first time. The Dodge County Sheriff's Department did a great job at being able to apprehend somebody for that particular one. But it's something that I've been seeing, in the last year and a half, where it's happening to more than just, that individual.
Yeah, and one thing that you hit on, that's a key tool that a lot of these scammers use is making themselves sound official, making them sound like they are representing, in this case, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, or any sort of financial institution, Department of Internal Revenue, or any of other groups like that. That's usually a script that they follow very closely, and in the hopes of getting people to believe them and to make them it makes the fiction that they're trying to sell easier.
I mean, they'll even give you an agent number. I mean, that number means nothing, or a case number. And it's, I've had plenty of customers tell me, well, I have this case number, and it's like, well, it doesn't mean anything. They just make it sound official by providing you what they think you want to hear the details are. So it is something that if they can make themselves sound important and it's serious, that's how they keep you on the hook. So.
I mentioned that recent incident that happened just in a press release that came out last week. I think I said Lamira. It's Lowell, actually. I just checked out. That was the Lowell area.
I was going to correct you, but I didn't want to be that person.
By all means, if you know I said something incorrectly, let me know. I want to make sure I get that correctly, say that correctly. But again, that happened in the Lowell area, and again, they in the middle of this situation that for a lot of people, I mean, I'll be the first to admit too, I'm sure that it would be easy for myself to be caught up, and you hear a lot of these flashy words of your account could be frozen, your potential legal trouble. But this individual had the wherewithal in that moment to realize something is amiss, something's not right. And I need to make sure that I either reach out to law enforcement. In this case, this is what they did. Is that something that, again, in your position and what you do on a day-to-day basis, is that something like, say, if somebody picks up a phone call and they start engaging in this person in dialogue and have conversations, and they're 30, 40, 50 minutes into it, it's still not too late if you haven't obviously given any sort of important financial bank statements, information of that nature, to do something about it, to call law enforcement, to call your bank, and put a hold on it and stop this before you do become a victim, correct?
Oh, absolutely. The example that I was giving, because that person was actively trying to take out more cash, I said, we're going to pause, and we called law enforcement immediately. It's just one of those things where you're not always going to get the outcome of being able to, make that whole thing play out so that you can make arrests. But that's your best bet. Is you have to have somebody else who can help intervene on one of those things. And in some of those cases, especially when people are trying to show up to your house, contact law enforcement.
I think that's also another really a key component to these scams that we're talking about here. I mean, I'm not like that's why you're here. You're the professional. You deal with these on a day-to-day basis. But just from what I've seen or have heard over the last 10, 15 years prior, a lot of this was just done via online, through emails, through phone calls. It was always, there was some distance of separation between the victim and the scammer. And that separation is starting to go away here in the last couple of years, it seems like.
That's the hard part, is we're at the point now that any way that they can get their hands on your funds, they're going to go for that. Yeah. It's coming from all directions. The different types of scams are just tremendous. It's in each, I can tell you, hey, we can talk about things like investment scams, but there's so many layers to it that it depends on how the conversation started. How do they contact you? What story are they telling you? So it's hard when it's coming from all those directions to be able to always identify, hey, this doesn't sound right.
I mean, it really comes down to pulling out every stop required to be able to pull off these scams. Like in the case, like we have been referencing in Lowell here the last week, that they ended up making an arrest in that case because somebody, and again, I'm hopefully I'm getting this correct. I believe from Chicago, Illinois, came up to Dodge County to give to be hand-to-hand transfer of these funds that they were attempting to fraud this victim out of, and I believe it was around $81,000 was what they were looking at trying to get.
Oh yeah, when your choice is I can get my hands on $81,000 in cash, yeah, they're going to make that trip.
Yeah.
And they do for less. So
and we always, the last time you were on, Shannon, we talked about this, but once that transfer is done, so many times it is really hard to find any sort of trail to find the perpetrators, to get any sort of closure in these cases, in these incidents, and have people arrested and charged. I'm sure it's just even harder so for people who actually come up in person. Obviously, you may have a witness statement, somebody can visualize somebody, but there is far less things to track down or trace. I'm sure if you just hand over your hard-earned cash and money to somebody in a suitcase and they drive off, and it's just as hard to track that down as it would be if somebody was sending it online.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's any way to try to take and put some I know the word. Try to remain anonymous.
Yes.
I got it.
There you go. Yeah.
But yeah, cash is one of those things where how do you track that after it disappears?
Yeah, and that's, again, it's so hard to for law enforcement, especially once they are contacted, and people don't really recognize these things until after the fact. They realize, I haven't heard from these people since I gave them my money. I think something's wrong here. And for law enforcement then to them, brought into the situation and to investigate this, this isn't, there's not a crime scene. There's not a lot of evidence that they can, categorize and put away and test and try to figure out what happened. It is extremely hard for these cases to get investigated thoroughly and find people and arrest them.
Well, and nobody's going to hang on to that much cash. At that point, they're looking at how can I put this back into the banking universe, and you're money laundering at that point. You're trying to place it back into to try to legitimize it. So they're not going to hang on to that evidence in cold hard cash at their home for weeks on end. They're going to be trying to put it in different accounts and things like that. So yeah, it's once it's out of your hands, that's the difficult part. So anytime that you can make contact with law enforcement or your financial institution before that transaction takes place, that's your best bet.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting note, Shannon, that you brought up that when people or scammers are taking this large amount of money from people, they're not going out and buying a yacht or some expensive car.
Not right away, at least.
Exactly. They know that, like you had mentioned, there needs to be things done to legitimize the money that they take. So again, it just, things get buried so quickly, and just with all the transactions and how many banking institutions we have and all the things that happen on a day-to-day.
That's my job. I get to
look
for that stuff.
You have to sift through that. So that is, I can't imagine that being. I mean, it's, again, what you're hired to do, but again, there's so much that you have to sift through and find, and but again, there are red flags that you can spot, and we don't want. It was kind of funny. We talked a little bit before we came on, and I don't want to share them because I don't want to be in trouble. But there are certain red flags that you catch on the back end that sometimes scammers don't necessarily realize are key and important things that for people in your position, even for law enforcement that are investigating these things, that they spot and check and make sure, if I see this, all right, now I know something's wrong. I'm gonna flag this, do our research, and figure out what's going on and make sure we can stop something fraudulent from happening.
Well, and that's a lot of my job, is being able to recognize patterns and things that are outside of those patterns. Some of them are just really humorous. You and I were talking about check fraud, and and I don't have a problem sharing this because I don't think I'm coaching any scammers at this point. If I am, I apologize. But with fraudulent checks, there's a dead giveaway on every, anytime that somebody fills in the word approved on the memo line of like a business check, it's like nobody says the word approved in your memo line on your check. I think they're almost always fraudulent checks. But they feel the need to make it look legitimate, and it's like that actually looks the opposite of legitimate. So
it does, because again, they think that they are doing things that will make whatever scam they're trying to pull off. They're trying to push it through the system as nonchalantly as possible. That nothing is suspicious in nature whenever it gets into the hands of bank professionals. But there are certain things like you just went through right now that
one's just the funniest one. So I thought I'd share that one.
Because a lot of times people will write just what they are spending that money on, just so they know for their own purposes afterwards. It's just you don't need to write approved.
Approved. What are we approving?
Exactly.
This fraudulent check? I don't think so.
Yeah, and then once you do see those red flags, Shana, what we talked a little bit about this last time you were on, I believe, but just kind of what is the next step in your job then? Is it reaching out to the customer, or is it getting law enforcement involved? What's the steps?
Of all of the above.
Yeah.
Sometimes it depends on the situation. So if our customer is the intended victim, then it's a conversation with that customer so that they can get on the same page. Because it's important for them to understand, hey, I know that you think that this is legitimate, but let's talk about why it's not. Or, sometimes it's more fact-finding for myself, where I'll reach out to them and say, tell me, how did you come to this? Like, how did we get here? Tell me the story leading up until right now. And I always explain, I'm not asking because I'm nosy. I'm asking because I'm trying to help you out. Maybe a little nosy, but that makes me good at my job.
That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah,
you're
right.
supposed to ask those questions. Go ahead.
I don't care what people spend their money on. It's more or less comes down to I want to make sure that I can help protect people as much as possible because, these people work hard for their money. And I wouldn't like it happening to me, and I know it's devastating for other people to go through. So if I can prevent that just by asking questions and having a conversation, I'm going to do that every time.
Yeah, and I know a thing that we talked about last time you were on is building that trust for customers of banks, and that they should trust their financial institutions, that they're not the ones out there doing the swindling and trying to scam people out of their money. They're there to protect their interests and their money. People in your positions, again, a Bank Secrecy Act officer, that's one of the key things that you do. And I'm sure that's always tough at times too, because you do get people out there who they don't know that. That's a fair position to come from, because again, before I've had this opportunity to meet you and chat about these things, I don't think I would have known exactly how to relate what you do and how that's important to me and what my funds in a bank. But and that's why we're here, is to communicate the importance of trusting people in your position, Shana. And when you do reach out, knowing, all right, something's seriously happening, I need to trust and work with people in your position to make sure nothing bad happens to my money.
Absolutely. And I get it. When you're being asked questions about something that you think is legitimate, then you might have this defensive feeling of, I'm not doing anything wrong. And it's like, no, that's not what we're trying to say. We just really want to help you. And, so I get it. I get the hesitation. It makes it even harder when people are told to lie to us. And given reasons to lie. I know that I touched the last time we talked. I touched on one of the big trends that I'm seeing is they're just convincing people that there's like financial institution insider fraud happening, and that's why you can't mention it to your bank because we don't know who the culprit is. Well, yeah, that's not happening. They just want to make sure that you're not telling professionals what's happening, because the professionals are going to be the ones that are saying there's something wrong here. And it's not what you've been told, it's that you're being lied to.
Right. It's mind games. It's what the scammers and people in those positions are doing. They're trying to make the person that they're trying to victimize as confused and questioning what they're being told at every corner, and they essentially don't know who to trust. And they end up trying, and that's why they are so successful a lot of times, because these, and I've seen it in my personal life and in other stories that I've read, a lot of times people will trust the first person that they end up talking to about the situation. They don't necessarily built that rapport, they built that connection. You bring in other people, professionals like the bank, into these conversations, and there's already those seeds of distrust planted by those scammers that it's hard for them to look past it and realize the situation that they're in is not a very good one.
It can get quite complicated. One of the struggles that I think is a lot of people are faced with is a lot of times if you have fraudulent activity, like on your debit card, a lot of companies will just send you a message that says, "Hey, we have this questionable thing. Let us know if this was you or not." Well, scammers know that, and so they also send out messages like that just as they're phishing for any sort of response, and it can get quite complicated because then you have a potential victim who thinks that they're talking to a fraud department, giving out their information, and there wasn't fraud at the time, but now they have your debit card information. Now there is legitimate fraud, like fraudulent alerts going off, but from the correct place. Yeah. And so that can get very confusing to people. And how do you keep that straight?
That's difficult. That's difficult to do. Again, we're joined with Shanna Hanneman from the Farmers and Merchants Union Bank in Columbus. She is the Bank Secrecy Act officer at that bank there in Columbus. Shanna, we just have a few minutes left already here on our program today. Yeah, it blows by every time we have these conversations because there's, again, so much to talk about when it comes to this topic. But I want to make sure we highlight one more thing before we say our goodbyes today, and that's, and I'll let you do the explaining because I feel like I will butcher this, but I will essentially set the stage here. It involves the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, referred to as FinCEN. Again, I'll let you take it away and explain what's important about this topic.
So at the beginning of this year, FinCEN has started collecting something called beneficial ownership information for companies that are deemed required to report that information regarding, who has ownership or control over entities. Anyone who's started a business prior to 2024 is going to need to look to see if they are going to be required to provide that information to FinCEN by the end of this year. Since that deadline is coming up, and because it is something new, FinCEN has put out an alert that there is a lot of fraudulent activity happening around that subject. So fake forms to be filled out, collecting fees, things that are not legitimate, trying to get information or money from people who just might not understand exactly the details of doing the process of reporting that information. My suggestion, especially for people who have businesses and entities, to find out more information is to visit fincen.gov. They have a lot of information. This alert that gets a little more specific about the kind of things that is being reported to them is out there on their website. And so I think it's just worth mentioning because as we're coming up on deadlines, that means, hey, we got to move quicker. We got to figure this out, and would hate for somebody to encounter somebody who is just trying to get something from you.
Take advantage of that situation.
Yep.
Yeah. And I believe that the deadline is January 1st of 2025. So
safe to say end of year.
End of year deadline here coming up. So again, the next 2.5, 3-ish months here as we close out 2024, there's a potential to see those increase here as we head to 2025.
Yep.
And again, more information on that topic is at FinCEN. That's FINCEN.gov//BOI. If anyone out there wants to learn more about that important topic. But just in a blink of an eye, our show is wrapping up here today. I want to thank our guests here on Community Comment, Shanna Hanneman. She is the Bank Secrecy Act Officer of Farmers and Merchants Union Bank in Columbus. Shanna, thank you again so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And that will do it for today's Community Comment.